I have played many critically acclaimed role-playing games in my life. RPGs are one of my favorite genres in gaming, and only a couple of those games have really captured what I love about them. To me, RPGs have a way of capturing a compelling narrative, unique battle system, and beautiful character depth in an all-in-one package. Some of my personal favorites of these are Earthbound, Golden Sun, Undertale, Xenoblade Chronicles, Bravely Default, and Ys 8. Even with many great RPGs crossed off the list, there are still many fantastic RPGs that I have had recommended to me. This video is dedicated to the one that people won't stop mentioning even to this day, Final Fantasy VII. My name is Nick, and welcome to a new series called Non-Nostalgic Look. In this series, I take a look at some games that are older and that have built up a reputation for being outstanding in their time, and see if it holds up today. An important point to this series is that I haven't played these games when they came out, so I didn't have any childhood ties to the game. I've only played these games recently. What better way to kick off this series than with one of the best RPGs of all time, Final Fantasy VII? How many best games of all time's list have had this game somewhere on it, and why? To start, let's look at the development history and part of the legacy that this series left. Final Fantasy is one of the most famous RPG series with 15 numbered entries, not counting the numerous spin-offs and sequels. With the series going on for as long as it has, and starting with the NES console, it makes sense that this game series has changed a lot over the years. What began as a turn-based RPG has become an action RPG with a lot of iteration in between. Final Fantasies 1 through 3 were for the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System, and used turn-based combat, while Final Fantasies 4 through 6 for the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo Entertainment System used active time battling. During this time, Squaresoft and Nintendo had a good relationship for developing on Nintendo platforms. Other great games made by Square for the Super Nintendo included Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Evermore, and Super Mario RPG. In between the release of Final Fantasy VI and the development of Final Fantasy VII, Square was finally working on creating a 3D Final Fantasy game, a dream they had discussed since Final Fantasy V. However, an immediate problem presented itself. While this was an extremely ambitious goal, there were issues with the storage capacities that came with the physical hardware, and discs were able to hold more memory. Nintendo had already decided to use cartridges for their newest console, the Nintendo 64, and Square did not want to settle with their next mainline installment of the Final Fantasy series. Square decided to join Sony to develop Final Fantasy VII for their new PlayStation. Considering my love of RPGs, I should have played at least a couple Final Fantasy games up to this point. However, I have not played a Final Fantasy game until my 20s, and have been surprisingly oblivious to the series when I was young. I've never owned a PlayStation, and my first console I played heavily was a Nintendo 64, which makes sense with Squaresoft's history. RPGs were also almost non-existent on the GameCube and Nintendo 64. Squaresoft had developed other RPGs that came to Nintendo platforms, like Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, but their mainline Final Fantasy games stayed on the PlayStation. Whatever the reason was, I was more than ready to jump on my chance to play Final Fantasy X in college. I thought it was fantastic, and it scratched a gaming itch that I've had for a very long time. I was ready to dive into the other ones from there. The next one to beat was Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII follows the story of Cloud Strife, a mercenary from Nibelheim who has just joined the resistance group Avalanche. Avalanche is an environmentalist group led by Barrett Wallace, a loud but headstrong leader set to take down the Shinra Corporation, who is destroying the planet by draining all of its Mako energy. The game starts with Cloud, Barrett, and fellow Avalanche members set out to destroy one of the Mako reactors. Without giving up too much of the story, they also meet Tifa Lockhart, Cloud's childhood friend, and Aerith or Aerith Gainsborough, the last member of the Ancients. After welcoming other members to the party like Cid and Red 13, the narrative turns into a battle between the Shinra Corporation, Sephiroth, and the party. The graphics of Final Fantasy VII are a unique change from the previous games. Final Fantasy VII is different from the previous installments of the series with their use of pre-rendered backgrounds. While this seems more in line with the graphics of Final Fantasy VI, The character models of Final Fantasy VII stick out more due to their 3D appearance. Final Fantasy VI's characters fit in better with the background and allow the graphics to almost seem timeless, but I'll get into this point a little bit later. I am playing this version of the game for the Nintendo Switch, and there are a couple differences with this port from the original. Some of the features include turning off random encounters, speeding up movement, and boost battling. The game has been ported many different times to multiple different devices, with some features being welcome additions in my eyes. Boost battling is one of these. While level grinding can be tedious in many older RPGs, boost battling offers a way to both experience new strategies and lessen the time spent away from the story. This mode automatically refills your limit gauge, health points, and magic points after your turn, which takes the difficulty of the fights and throws it out the window. Even someone like me, who sometimes enjoys level grinding in games, can tell when it goes too far, especially when there's multiple strategies the player can use within the battling system. If you're looking for an authentic experience, don't use boost battling in boss fights. I accidentally used it on one of the Turk boss fights, originally thinking it balanced itself by having you take more damage, but I was very wrong. I made sure I didn't use it on any other fights and only used it when grinding for new limit levels. The other port differences were nice inclusions, but I didn't use them that much. I still can see them greatly enhancing other players' experiences though. Many of the RPGs I have played recently have done something unique or different to the typical RPG formula. A good example is Undertale. Instead of a solely turn-based or action combat system, they utilized a hybrid system of turn-based and bullet hell elements to engage the player. While this kind of innovation isn't necessary, a slight deviation can keep the combat fresh. Final Fantasy VII does this by incorporating the limit gauge into the then standard active time battle system. The genius of this system comes with its simplicity and how well it's integrated with the active time battle system. As you continue to use limit gauge attacks, you also obtain more powerful limit attacks and buff. After beating Final Fantasy VII, I can easily see why the active time battle system is beloved by so many people. It's a very inventive way to make turn-based battling more engaging, while also keeping the tensions that these fights can have. After beating Final Fantasy VII, I jumped on the opportunity to finish my Final Fantasy VI playthrough. I greatly enjoyed the active time battling system, but I also love the inclusions of the limit breaks into Final Fantasy VII. When taking damage in the fight, your limit gauge fills based on the damage done. Once the gauge is full, you have access to an extra powerful attack, healing move, or status buff. These options can single-handedly turn the tide of battle and are sometimes necessary to get the upper hand on the more difficult bosses. My minor complaint about this system is that you can't save this attack for later. While you can choose to defend or use a magic attack, the normal attack is switched to the limit choice. I prefer Final Fantasy X's option to save your more powerful attack till a later time. This game does pacing better than I ever thought it would. Many RPGs can fall under the same run fight cycle, but I didn't feel that Final Fantasy VII was constrained to this style of gameplay loop. I believe this was done with the different ways to interact with the world, even if it was minimal. Whether it was the minigames at the Gold Saucer, the different vehicles to move around the world, or leaping onto a beam from a dolphin, it often had a unique way to get from point A to point B. Final Fantasy VII also utilized a huge overworld to explore and allowed the player to see many different areas with multiple different vehicles, with including some side quests in the town spread throughout. This level of pacing I feel is necessary to have the game be accessible to a wide variety of players. If you just want to experience the game in a linear fashion, you'll enjoy the game greatly. However, if you seek out the extra side content, you are rewarded with extra characters and essential plot details. Final Fantasy soundtracks are known for being legendary, and credit for Final Fantasy VII, just like many other mainline games, goes to Nobuo Uematsu. I won't be able to do the man justice when talking about his compositions, but what I can tell you is this. Out of the Final Fantasy games I've played, one of the first things I've noticed in all of them is the music. The crazy part is that they somehow felt familiar, even though I'd never played the games before. This even goes with Final Fantasy X, the first Final Fantasy game I've ever beaten. These soundtracks invoke a feeling of familiarity, even when you haven't played the game as a youth. Even without nostalgia, Final Fantasy music has easily slipped into some of my favorite music in video games. I don't have many complaints with this game. I would classify my issues with the game being minor at best, and one of them was the method to obtain the highest limit break moves. Obtaining the level 4 limit for some characters is very tedious. While I did enjoy unlocking most of the extra limit attacks, I'm no completionist in that regard. One of the only times I didn't feel fully engaged in the game was when I was in the arena obtaining the necessary battle points to get Omnislash. I also didn't enjoy the Wutai side quest. I know it's optional content, but I'm an avid explorer when it comes to playing games. I always try to visit all of the towns in the world, and it doesn't really become optional once Yuffie steals all of your materia. You can rebuy them, but you lose the progress of upgrading the materia, and I did not want to do that. It's a very minor complaint, but still one I wanted to mention as it can cause the main story to come to a halt, especially if you had some rare materia. Now for the question you've all been wondering about. Does this game hold up today? To me, this is an easy yes. Everything I look for in an RPG is done beautifully, if not better than modern RPGs. I love the cast of characters, music, settings, story, and battle system. For others, possibly newer or younger gamers, it might be a little more complicated. And I believe that the graphics would be a divisive part of the game. While older graphical styles never personally bug me, these graphics aren't consistent throughout the game. This is not as much of an issue with Final Fantasy VI because everything was in 2D, with Mode 7 giving the illusion of 3D. The 3D character models of Final Fantasy VII stick out more against the 2D backgrounds. You can see the graphical differences in the cutscenes as well. Some cutscenes are full motion with lifelike characters, while others still utilize blocky models that are used to traverse the world. Players who started on newer consoles might have issues with this, especially if their first Final Fantasy game was a later entry like 10 or 15. While I liked seeing the graphics and how they evolved between the mainline entries, the disparities seen throughout the game can definitely confuse people playing Final Fantasy VII in the present day. One thing I loved about Final Fantasy VII that I don't see most JRPGs do well is blend humor in with its more serious story. The first time this really stuck out to me is when breaking into the Don's brothel. Tifa was taken, and your plan is to break her out. In order to do so, you have to collect a wig and dress to have Cloud sneak in with Aeris. All of this is coupled with comments from Aeris talking about how pretty Cloud looks as a girl. I was laughing constantly during this chapter. The main story mission continued the narrative, injected humor into the situation, and didn't lose focus that missions like these have a tendency to do. Most RPGs that I have played lean more serious or humorous. Earthbound and Paper Mario are examples of games that heavily rely on their comical nature, while Xenoblade Chronicles comes across in a stricter manner. Modern RPGs should use Final Fantasy VII as an example for a game that can do both. It's a rarity this is done well, and Final Fantasy VII is special in that regard. Final Fantasy VII also works well with its controls, except in the minigame department. As older games were developed on less advanced hardware, and the fact that games made in this time were the first attempts at 3D gaming, it would make sense that many people would call the controls clunky. This was especially prevalent when playing the games of the Gold Saucer. I personally noticed it when playing the basketball and submarine minigame, but I was still able to figure them out after a bit of trial and error. While the Gold Saucer is mainly optional side content, it showed that there was still a lot of work that needed to be done to fine-tune the controls in the later games and side missions. I still say this is a minor issue, because the controls for the main game work perfectly fine. This game has something for everyone. Whether you choose to engage a game for the story or the gameplay, Final Fantasy VII has you covered. Both of these elements of Final Fantasy VII are better than RPGs that have come out in the past 5 years. While I would argue that turn-based combat systems in RPGs are becoming less popular, it doesn't mean that they are becoming completely abandoned. Games like Dragon Quest XI are still showing that they are an audience for turn-based battling mechanics. This is the game that I was expecting I Am Setsuna to be. While I did enjoy I Am Setsuna a lot, It's crazy to think that Final Fantasy VII beat it in almost every way. After beating Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VII, I started to develop an appreciation for this legendary game franchise. I can begin to understand how this series has such a dedicated fan base, even with how much the game series has changed throughout the years. These games have an immense amount of depth to them, and they always seem to leave you wanting more. My personal favorite parts of Final Fantasy VII are infiltrating Shinra Corp, the airship theme, the date at the Gold Saucer, and the Sephiroth final boss fight. It is crazy to think that this game was released for the PlayStation originally, but it does RPGs better than I ever would have imagined. This game has slipped into one of my new personal favorite RPGs, and it has given me a glance at how great its golden age was. I hope you enjoyed the first take at a non-nostalgic look. I really enjoyed making this video and am welcoming suggestions for new games to do as well. This is Nick, signing off.